So if there are truly bad ideas, we'd want to know what these bad ideas are, who's advocating for them. And we wouldn't want people with bad ideas just hide in a corner. Like we want them in the public sphere.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the thing is that, bad ideas don't go away by being banned on Twitter. Like they just go underground and they fester and they become even more potentially influential movements than if they were just allowed to be in the public sphere so people can accurately assess them and the people who are voicing them.
Well, let's make a little equation. Bad ideas plus isolation plus resentment equals some very bad reactions in the end. So I think if you exclude people like that, now they have a purpose or proof of their bad ideas as well.
Hello, welcome to this week's Critical Compass weekly chat. This is the week of March the 4th, and we're recording on March the 5th, talking about some news that happened last week and early this week, actually, too. There's been some pretty notable things developing in Canadian politics. So we've got a couple main topics today. James would like to lead us off with some news regarding a new bill, Bill C-63, I believe it is. And James has been looking into this. And why don't you take her away, sir?
Yeah, so Bill C-63, it's a new bill. There's a lot there, and there's kind of two pillars we have to kind of understand. It's almost like it's a Trojan horse for some bad ideas, and there's some things that would need to be changed if this was to pass, or it's going to create problems, or it can be. It would not be a good use of our parliamentary system to have this bill.
Hold on, James. Sorry, I got to interrupt you here. Are you suggesting that the current Trudeau Liberals would introduce a piece of legislation that has ulterior motives?
What I'm trying to say is that if you have a few things you really want to get in, you would not introduce a bill with some extremely heavy-handed other elements. So like you would want it to go through. So you wouldn't you make something as like clear and focused as possible? Like that's what I'm asking here, what I'm suggesting. So the first pillar I think is something that pretty much everybody can agree on is the child abuse material distribution, revenge porn, and amendments for like AI generated content using somebody's likeness, all currently criminal acts in some form or another. And it's just changing. This bill will make online service providers have to report, and it gives a way of taking down this material and or keeping these service providers accountable.
So putting some accountability, some responsibility on the platform hosts.
Yeah. So they can't really hide behind this notion of currently most platforms, they say that they're not a publisher because they're not they're not the editors of the content. They are providing a space for people to upload. So since they don't create it directly, that has been the excuse for certain platforms to let some material slide, or maybe they have like a lapse period in how long it takes for something to actually be reported or taken down. So that part of the bill, I think, is excellent. Like we should definitely give more tools to help control and punish and actually follow up and prevent this sort of content from existing, especially with the advent of AI-powered tools where you can take a single photo and AI can generate video to that. Mm-hmm. So you can see how that can superpower revenge porn like we haven't seen before.
Yeah.
Um, easily, yeah. So that side of the bill is not controversial. The other side is making amendments to hate speech. And the problem with hate speech is it really depends on how you classify hate speech. If you're using the definition of detestable language, I'm like, well, that's a large umbrella. And if that was the case,
detestable to whom?
Yeah, there's a subjective nature. So the people advocating for these amendments to hate speech don't realize that they can easily be somebody who is spreading hate. So there, even one idea is that, well, during the pandemic, you had some very hateful statements against people who maybe had doubts about the efficacy of lockdowns or who refused to take any of the COVID shots. It doesn't take that long to see even like news articles with demonizing language. There's even some repositories like showing dozens and dozens of hateful published news stories. So if that's detestable, if that's focusing on a group, and if that's classifying them as subhuman, under this bill, they could be charged with like $20,000 in fines or greater for those instances of hate speech. So I think the people supporting that part of the bill don't realize how it can be turned against them. Another aspect of it is the focus on targeted, like on specific groups. It's the blaming groups for part of that hate speech would be blaming a specific group for the ills of society. And
here's the article you're talking about, I believe.
Oh, that is that's one of the, Toronto Star has a few.
I have no empathy left for the willfully unvaccinated. Let them die.
So the thing with that article, if you look into it, they went through Twitter and Twitter and social media and found statements, like the most outrageous statements, and then posted it on there almost like it was a popular, like commonly held kind of ideas of the majority. So it wasn't even that those were like a good representation of that. So the other part of this hate speech is that making targeted statements about a group being responsible for the ills of society. Well, like that has a lot of historical parallels. You pretty much any massive violent event in history often is like this. The spearhead of that is a focus on one group and blaming, having a scapegoat for the problems, where these problems are often multifactorial and more complex than that.
I think that's part of what it requires, actually, to have a kind of a social mob reaction to to that sort of input. I think you need that, actually.
Yeah. The problem is with this bill and this language is the focus on a group and blaming them for society's ills. Well, we've talked about DEI training, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the cornerstone of that is blaming society's problems on on white people and men and able-bodied people and straight people.
And men, again, second time.
And men again, yeah, double up on men. So in this case, DEI training would technically be hate speech under this new law. Like, I don't know it would be like, I don't think it would be anybody would actually go against, well, like maybe they wouldn't be the first ones to be targeted with this.
Yeah, they'd find some way to pretzel their way out of it.
Yeah, but the other part of this legislation is anonymous reporting. So it's powering anonymous reporting for a wide umbrella of hate speech with massive amount of fines. And even
and jail time too. I think I remember reading, right? There's for calls to genocide or something like that, right?
Yeah, there can be jail time. There can be there's a component of it for future crime, like if somebody is suspected to spread hate or if they're gonna spread hate in the future, if they're suspected, then they can be sentenced to house arrest and a curfew. And this language is like absolutely
Orwellian.
Yeah, it is. It's extreme. And so what I don't know is that, are the people submitting this bill, do they truly believe this is a good wording and this is the kind of language that will provide clarity in our society for actually dealing with some of these problems? Or are they overreaching that it gets pulled back to something still Orwellian, but like not as crazy?
Yeah, that's interesting you say that, because there's a kind of a Chris Voss, the guy who wrote Never Split the Difference. He's I don't know if you know him.
Is that a negotiating book?
Yeah. He was a former FBI hostage negotiator who's turned into his second career now is a kind of like a business consultant advisor. That's a technique that he talks about that is used a lot. He didn't invent it or anything, but he describes it in the book where, in a negotiation, one technique to kind of get to where you want is to throw out a kind of a ridiculous number. Say, in a monetary negotiation, you throw out a ridiculous number to recalibrate your opponent's expectations subconsciously, even though you both know you're not going to end up there. And then when you settle, at a more reasonable number, it's still unreasonable because you've been recalibrated by the initial overreach. So it's interesting. It's
the same principle of why there's $100 bottles of wine sitting next to $30 bottles of wine, where you're like, well, that $30 bottle of wine doesn't seem so much when you compare it to the one right next to it. Yeah. So it does reframe. It's like an inflation of these ideas and how extreme these ideas are. And I think we're slowly getting pushed into the way that we're like, these extreme ideas are slowly being normalized in a way that they shouldn't. Even the idea of being fully canceled or having social media completely wiped or deleted, that used to be quite rare and reserved for the most extreme cases. And it doesn't take much for somebody to get deleted off one of these platforms. Part of it is like, obviously you have top-down approaches from whatever laws are implemented by a government in a region. But then you've got this other layer. It adds a little bit of complexity of a platform like Facebook or Instagram, Twitter, or even YouTube, where they've got their own code of conduct, which is partially informed by some of the major countries that they operate out of, and they are kind of self-policing and self-censoring based on those policies as well. And then you have self-censorship. Like the bottom layer is self-censorship of people censoring themselves through. Maybe you think of it as there's a social layer to it of like, well, I don't want to offend people, so they're self-censoring that way. I don't want to get canceled, so they're self-censoring that way. And even, let's say somebody's a creator on a platform, they're going to self-censor because they're going to align with the monetary incentive. So even if they're not worried about offending anybody, there's still going to be a tweak, and maybe they're not saying certain words, or they're changing the way that they approach things just to stay on a platform.
Yeah, and if legislation like this has the effect that we just talked about, really what'll happen is that'll just kind of further shrink an already very small Overton window. And when you combine that with what you say, you've got perhaps a noble intent of not wanting to cause offense, and then a more selfish intent of not wanting to be canceled, with a third aspect of, if you're a creator, if you're somebody with any sort of public presence at all, on any social media, with not wanting to be have your potential income restricted. So it's a perfect storm in all fronts, if that's what your goal is.
Yeah, it's not setting up a space where citizens feel comfortable talking about any specific issue, because identity politics are interwoven pretty much into every policy and issue now. It's difficult to say something that couldn't be interpreted as hate. Yeah. So, for example, you have parents that maybe don't. There are parents that do not want to enable their child to go through a medical intervention at a young age for cosmetic reasons. This kind of dovetails into some of the discussions we've already had on the transgender debate. But the fact that parents have lost custody of their children because they haven't affirmed their children's identity, where in this case, they're maybe saying, let's go, let's try some counseling. Let's try to wait it out. Let's try to look at other options instead of like a hormonal or surgical intervention. In those cases, they would be deemed under this law hateful and or transphobic for not affirming their child's identity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So as the umbrella gets wider and wider, the chances of you breaking one of these, the chances of you committing a hate speech is higher and higher, like every day.
Oh, it reaches nearly 100% if you want to be involved in any of these discussions at all, which Jordan Peterson said this years ago. In order to be able to think, you have to be willing to risk causing offense. How else is anyone ever supposed to be able to sort out the good from the bad ideas if you can't, risk having a bad idea or having your idea challenged at all, which is what the really what the goal of a lot of people is in this situation, is to not have any of their current ideas challenged, either because they know that they're bad ideas or they know that they can't withstand any criticism.
These are the same people who, if they view all of society as like through power dynamics, oppressor versus oppressed power dynamics, they're viewing everything through that, which means their policies and what they're advocating is through the same power dynamics. It's a reversal of power dynamics. And I think when you get a case where they truly believe what they're doing is right, why would they leave room for people to disagree with that? They like,
because they're right. They have
a moral duty to shut down dissent.
Imperative. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I was reading a quote today. I don't know why it came to my head, but I was trying to find the source of the quote. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. And it's, long story short, it's very hard to nail down the actual source of this quote. It's been edited and changed a little bit over the years in different religions, and print copies in different languages have different versions of it, but the intent kind of stays the same. So that's what this sort of feels like to me anyway.
Yeah. Well, it is the thing where it's hard to discern if, like, how much is good intentions, and then there is always a malice element that can appear, or a revenge element of like, well, we're the good guys, they're the bad guys. They did us dirty in this way, so we have to fix it by either just a heavy-handed approach.
Mm.
The problem is the people who support these heavy-handed approaches, or these kind of amendments that shut down debate, don't realize that it can quickly become weaponized against them. And history shows that it does too.
Yeah, they never think about the what's going to happen when the social winds shift and these rules are put in place. I've had this discussion with people before regarding, this is maybe will lead us into our next topic actually, but when the COVID mandates came out, the QR codes and other things associated with needing to show proof of certain medications, or medical interventions anyway to enter certain establishments. You gotta think about it in the way of, well, you might be in favor of this one, but what happens when something else comes along that you're not in favor of? What happens when you want to have a discussion of maybe regarding the government's role to play in abortion, for example? And if you open the door for the government being able to demand certain things or restrict certain things from you because of their particular view on a particular medical intervention at a particular time, you don't have so much of a leg to stand on logically when it comes to something that you disagree with, don't you? That's hard to get people to reframe like that.
Yeah, the last 4 years have really shifted what things may be drawn upon in the future. So lockdowns are potentially a tool that may be used again. They may try the QR codes again for entry into places. So that's something.
People laugh when you talk about things like this, but it's like this right now. That's happening in China, and it was happening prior to COVID too, but even more so now. Like it's not an unreasonable thing to think, because it is literally current. Like, people call you a conspiracy theorist or look at you funny when you talk about social credit scores, but literally right now in China, people have social credit scores, and they are restricted or allowed to do certain things because of those scores.
Yeah, they're publicly shamed for a low credit score. They cannot get either, like, maybe they can't get a rental agreement or a mortgage or
even public transportation. I think
public transportation, they can't. There's restrictions on mobility, so there are certain checkpoints that, during COVID, they were keeping people in certain areas and not letting travel. And I think the justification was, well, we're controlling the spread, but you're also just, again, treating people like cattle, and you're boxing them in. And in North America, like, we take our mobility rights quite seriously. And that was already, we weren't quite at the degree of China, but we were starting down that road.
Mm-hmm.
And for anybody who's not familiar with what's happening in China, take a look. There's even like news articles exploring the social credit system, even I think like 2018. I think as early as that, they had a few pilot projects, and then it's expanded. So when you give power to authoritarians, it's like not surprising that it would unfold in this way.
Yeah, and they're quite hesitant to ever give it back, despite what they may say.
Yeah, as soon as you're tied into a system, as soon as you're banking, as soon as like multiple aspects of your life are tied into a system, if any part of that is compromised, your basic like amenities become very difficult to even, like, if you can't use your credit card, and let's say there's no cash, you're locked out from buying food, or maybe you have to get somebody to buy food for you. Like, these things are not, it's not a pretty picture, which is why we're trying to highlight some of this. The question is, like, well, I guess just for from what you notice, like with friends or family, how much have you mentioned kind of the social credit system and kind of the risks of some of these policies in Canada and how we may or may not get to that kind of dystopian point?
Well, I don't. To be honest, I try not to bring it up anymore for the most part. When most of my friends and family have kind of, I mean, they know my opinions on these things, but most of them are not. They are not ready to accept that there are actors in our institutions who either don't know at all what they're doing and are just kind of going through the motions of an agenda that they don't quite understand, or B, are actively trying to push policy into society that will lead down those roads, because whatever their intentions are, if they're the people who if they're more of the same kind of person who truly believes that they have the moral arc of history on their side, or if whatever the rationale is, if there's some monetary incentive in it for them, or both, as it may turn out, they just aren't really ready to accept that, because Canada has had I mean, this sort of changes by the era, but by and large, we've sort of had the luxury of having a relatively above board, relatively trustworthy media apparatus, and generally a fairly innocuous political history. We don't have a whole lot of scandals and very big earth-shattering politics here. Over the years, like, we haven't had that sort of nothing like what happened in 2020, 2021. So it's hard for people to reframe when sort of I don't know the phrase, but when the wolf sort of sheds his sheep's clothing, you know what I mean? It's hard to accept that. So it's easier for people to accept that people like us who discuss these things and worry about these things and try to actively avoid these things perpetuating. It's easier for them to believe that, we're just the kind of the outliers, kind of the nuts ones, sort of the conspiracy theory minded ones, and the institutions are still fine. That's more intellectually palatable for them. So I don't know, what's your experience been with that?
Well, I definitely also made the observation that it does seem like Canada used to be a more boring place on the international stage. Like, we didn't have as much as maybe the last few years, where things are really starting to, maybe I'm just noticing it more, or maybe it has shifted as well, but I'm starting to see, I think, a little bit of both. Like, I'm starting to see more and more the corruption, because we've had scandals, but again, they haven't been in the public consciousness to the same degree. So,
I don't think people realize just how much damage Trudeau has done to Canada's reputation on the world stage. Like, it is very obvious for anyone who pays attention anytime he shows up at a G7 event or some kind of...
The body language.
Yeah, like, no one has any time for him. Like, no one takes him seriously. And that reflects on us, right? That reflects on Canada's, general standing in the world at large, when we just keep re-electing the guy, like, no one can stand him. It's not just like, Trump or whoever else, or Xi Jinping. It's not just those guys. It's you can tell, like, no one wants to have his stink on them, basically, right?
Well, I think when it comes to the idea that, like, our institutions are, I think friends and family, they believe the institutions aren't corrupt, but they obviously have their bad guys that they're fighting against within the institutions, but they trust in the actual institutions
Itself, yeah.
Yeah, because I think the idea that the institution itself is corrupt is such a scary idea that well, if nobody's driving the ship,
Mhm.
like how are we, are we going to go off a cliff? They would be so worried about the consequences of somebody not driving the ship that it's scary to know, it's scary to even consider that. So I think it's a protective mechanism that way. I do have discussions where I'm fairly patient in discussions, and I've just been sharing little things, and I'm always curious on well, you're never gonna never just gonna say one sentence and convince somebody and just flick a switch.
Yeah.
But I'm curious if you make somebody think about something that they didn't consider. And one entry point is even before the pandemic, I was deep in kind of the nutrition sphere and looking at how our nutritional studies were set up and the issues with observational trials and the limitations, and how a good chunk of these claims of risk and cause and effect are really just based on observing patterns of based on self-reported food questionnaires of people, and they don't differentiate between eating meat as a burger and fries and a large Coke versus eating a home-cooked steak. You don't have anything to kind of filter out these healthy user biases. So I went into the pandemic with an understanding of how modeling and how these studies can be steered in to create whatever result you want. You can hack the p values. You can design a study to say what you want. And there's a lot of ways of manipulating this to either align with how you're getting funded, because there's a big conflict of interest right there, or maybe you have an ideological motivation of, if a researcher is plant-based, are they going to get more of a favorable response to studies or the data that confirms their own ideas? So I find it useful often to point out the fact that the sugar industry literally paid off scientists to shift the blame for fat causing heart disease 50 years ago. So that's a known thing. And we know that there's corruption in these spaces. So if you can point to other examples of corruption, I think that helps people entertain the ideas that well, maybe we should be a little bit more critical on these current institutions.
Yeah. Yeah. And a good way as well to do that is Peter Boghossian talks about this in his book. I think it was co-written with James Lindsay, actually, How to Have Impossible Conversations. He talks about how one of the most effective ways of changing somebody's mind is to show them somebody that they already respect, having the opinion that you are trying to show them as an alternative opinion. So it will be another thing as well, where it'll take some public figures who either may have been silent or may have been hesitant or even frightened of being canceled, sharing their opinions on certain political or social matters that otherwise would have a following that may not have associated with them with those opinions. It'll take some of those people getting brave and voicing their actual thoughts rather than what they're supposed to be thinking about certain things, and that'll help move the needle a little bit too.
And that only happens when we have a clear space for the exchange of ideas. So that's the whole thing with this bill C-63 is, are we giving the chance for ideas to be out in the open, to be dissected? Sun is the best disinfectant.
Mm-hmm.
So if there are truly bad ideas, we'd want to know what these bad ideas are, who's advocating for them. And we wouldn't want people with bad ideas just hide in a corner. We want them in the public sphere.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the thing, is that, bad ideas don't go away by being banned on Twitter. They just go underground and they fester and they become even more potentially influential movements than if they were just allowed to be in the public sphere so people can accurately assess them and the people who are voicing them.
Well, let's make a little equation. Bad ideas plus isolation plus resentment equals some very bad reactions in the end. So I think if you exclude people like that, now they have a purpose or proof of their bad ideas as well.
Yeah, and they don't get people like, people who do have truly very dangerous ideas don't get discouraged or have their minds changed by being censored, right? That just further motivates them. So
yeah.
Well, I think we can maybe segue a little bit into our second main topic of today. I'm going to share some screen caps here, and this will be the first one. So this is the actual article from what happened yesterday. The article headline I don't necessarily love, but essentially what happened is that there was a committee formed to discuss the firing of some scientists from a microbiology lab in Winnipeg. This happened kind of during the COVID pandemic, and there has been some, I don't want to say conspiracy around it, because it really isn't a conspiracy at this point, but there has been some very important questions being asked about what exactly those scientists were doing in that lab in Winnipeg in 2019, and what ramifications that might have had in relation to the COVID pandemic. So I'm going to pull up another article here. And this is just a couple days ago. So the article headline from the National Post is "Fired Scientists at Winnipeg Lab Worked Closely and Covertly with Chinese Government," CSIS report says. This is from February 28th, so just a few days ago. And yesterday, a committee determined that even with this report saying, this is the quote from CSIS, the service assesses that Mrs. I don't want to mispronounce her name. I think it's Mrs. Qiu developed deep cooperative relationships with a variety of People's Republic of China institutions and has intentionally transferred scientific knowledge and materials to China in order to benefit the PRC government. Reads a letter from January 2021 recommending her security clearance be revoked. So a committee in the House of Commons determined that even with that CSIS, very unambiguous CSIS statement, this is not worth investigating.
Why would CSIS even say that if it wasn't of like grave importance? It's the same kind of thing. If you have standards and procedures within, like, this is the type of communications we have, or this is what we're sharing for results, or because there is collaboration between different labs, but there's obviously security concerns when it comes to matters of like a biolab like this. So whatever policies they have, if these individuals broke those policies, then you'd want them investigated. So that's pretty simple.
It's very simple. I'm going to read you another portion from that article. Qiu was found to have shipped sensitive materials outside of the National Microbiology Lab without approval, including antibodies to the China National Institute for Food and Drug Control, as well as some others to the United Kingdom and the United States for testing. She also admitted to having sent several emails to research associates through personal email accounts on Gmail or Yahoo instead of her personal corporate account. As for Cheng, this is the second scientist, he not only used his personal email accounts and unauthorized external drives to conduct government business, but also breached security policies regarding students under his supervision by giving them access to the scientific network through a computer in the laboratory. So this Qiu, the main scientist here, the woman, she kind of, from what I understand, she kind of rose to prominence by having developing quite an interesting I don't know the science behind it, but it's like a multifaceted approach using monoclonal antibodies to essentially to cure COVID in a it's to cure Ebola in a laboratory setting. So there was initially some worries that there may have been really potentially lethal substances being shipped overseas without proper procedures. Apparently, she was not necessarily known for being for following the letter of the law when it came to transferring samples. I'm going to share another article here, which even further complicates the matter of like why they would say this is not something worth investigating, because apparently in June of 2021, Patty Haydu said, in this particular case, the information requested has both privacy and national security implications. Compliance with the order without proper safeguards in place would put sensitive information at the risk of public release. So this is something that apparently is so sensitive that they can't discuss it publicly, but at the same time, it's also not worth investigating. So here it shows what I was just saying here. Qiu had earlier been responsible for a shipment of Ebola and don't know what this is, Henipa viruses to China's Wuhan Institute of Virology. That's very interesting. But even though they don't know what it is and haven't investigated it, there's no connection between the transfer of viruses cited in this order and the subsequent
they know for
departure of
sure
these
it's
employees.
not that.
No, and there's definitely no link to COVID-19. They definitely know that. So these are the perfect examples of our government officials talking out of both sides of their mouths. But it doesn't stop there, because actually in that same year, in 2021, just a little bit later, you'll have to forgive me for all the links I have here, but Canadians must know what our lab's role was in COVID's origins. China resists more investigation in its borders, but one strand of the trail leads to Winnipeg, writes author and journalist Elaine Dewar. Now, you can't see the full article on this view, but if I go to a reader view, there is a section where, let me see if I can find the section. Here we go. This is the Winnipeg Lab. The NML is Canada's only high-containment lab for the study of human pathogens. Its top Level 4 lab, the sort devoted to the most dangerous microbes, was led by, again, I think Xiangguo Qiu, recipient in 2018 of Governor General's Innovation Award for an antibody cocktail against Ebola. Xiangguo Qiu and her husband, Keding Cheng, were marched out of that lab in 2019 by the RCMP, their security clearances and access to data allegedly withdrawn. Our federal government claimed this was nothing serious, just something to do with administrative matters. Yet it occurred just months after Qiu sent 15 strains of Ebola, again this Nipah and other glycoproteins, to the WIV. Those samples helped seed the WIV's own newly opened Level 4 lab. And what do we know, James, about Wuhan's Institute of Virology Level 4 lab?
We know it was denied as having anything to do with the last 4 years.
Just like these scientists being escorted out by the RCMP and having CSIS reports written about them, just like that has nothing to do with this either. And you're a conspiracy theorist if you think otherwise, sir.
Well, even just taking it on face value, you listed not only just like the sharing of like a result of something, the physically sending lab samples and breaching security concerns. There, you can't accidentally use the wrong email address. Like, there's no plea of ignorance to this. Like, these are very clear examples of a breach of policy, the breach of conduct, and like, why are they not investigating this other than to cover up any other potential corruption? That would be my conclusion there, that the lack of looking at this further implicates enough of the people around that it would create too much collateral damage. Therefore, they don't want to look into it further.
Yeah, there's another article here too that it's a good read. if a little bit maybe wishy-washy in its unwillingness to find a link where one very obviously exists. It's a long form article. It's by McLean's. It's a brilliant scientist was mysteriously fired from a Winnipeg virus lab. No one knows why.
No one.
So it's not a single person knows why. It's a quite a long read. There is a section here that discusses, and it's going to take me just a second here, but there is, here it is, the materials transfer agreement. So this is what apparently was her biggest issue, is that she just didn't like following procedure when it came to these things. Personally, I don't believe in MTAs for these materials. There was a lot of like kind of playing a little bit fast and loose with some very deadly pathogens. And if you're going to do that with something like Ebola, I mean, who's to say you wouldn't do that with other viruses that maybe you'd be working on in an unofficial context? And I can't remember if it's that article or the National Post one, but there are definitely ties with China for this scientist. It was the National Post article. So I'm reading another quote here. The service assesses that Ms. Qiu developed deep cooperative relationships. Oh, I think I already read this quote, but she definitely had relationships with Chinese officials, and there was even some implication that there may have been a sort of a, how there exists in China certain like work programs that kind of send Chinese people to other countries to infiltrate is the wrong word, but like to sort of become influential in certain institutions, and then with the ultimate goal of bringing that information and that experience back to China ultimately. So that's sort of the idea of what she was doing potentially on behalf of the PRC.
Well, that opens up kind of the question of, if you look at China, they don't let just anybody into their labs. They've got quite a tight lid on that. And it would make sense that if other countries were quite lax in who they let in, like for clear, like if the security clearance can be passed by pretty much any scientist, then why wouldn't they send people over? Like that doesn't seem that crazy to me.
Yeah. I found the portion here. It's I'll share it again. CSIS discovered Qiu had applied for and likely received a position under China's 1,000 Talents program, a government-sponsored program to recruit Chinese experts, which also allows them to keep jobs in Western countries. Qiu's position came through the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and CSIS determined that the 1,000 Talents program offers researchers up to $1 million in research subsidies and better access to visas and Chinese healthcare. Ain't that something?
So with that information, if we ask the questions of like, how many of these scientists should we trust, or what screening methods should we, like, how do we vet, and from like a security
or are we
aspect,
vetting at all?
Are we vetting? Like, but if you ask those questions, that would be a hateful thing, because it's targeting Chinese scientists, and we can't have any group targeted. Yeah, that would be racist. So
yeah,
you can see how, I imagine even writing these articles, some of these writers would be dancing around the implication of their words. That's maybe why they don't feel confident in making any definitive statements or links. Like they're just like, well, here's a quote, here's a quote, here's a quote. Like, I know it's good to stay completely like objective and non-biased.
Yeah.
But at the same time, yeah, the being too impartial to the point that you can't even. This is the kind of case where like an opinion piece or two, a to get somebody in to write in to like sum up some of these ideas.
Yeah, somebody
together
taking a chance.
Might be good in this case.
Well, and I mean, it's something that I don't know. We're gonna put all these links in the show notes here, but in one of those articles, I'm pretty sure they talked about how there was some thought that after it was either 2017 or 2018 when Canadian officials apprehended that was it a Huawei that Huawei executive that was under investigation in the U.S. and there was some thought, maybe just some kind of theorizing that with how relations between China and Canada really cooled off after that, some of what happened in the Winnipeg lab may have been an attempt to sort of not smooth over those relations, but just kind of look the other way for things that were pretty clearly breaches of security, because either Canadian officials didn't want to rock the boat, or they were told to not, make a stink about this, even though there were some policies and procedures being ignored or thwarted, or however it happened. That was a theory about why this could have been allowed to happen.
Yeah, it's difficult even in the public eye. Our Goldfish Memory, where we have more and more scandals, more and more things that should make the average person just say, like, what's going on? These things don't seem to be ringing the alarm bells of the average person. And like we've seen, I guess Twitter X is not the most neutral sample of opinions, but when having discussions with people and you share a link that's like clearly, one example would be like, well, the idea that the drought and the warm weather is the sole cause of all the all the fires in the last few years.
We'll link to this discussion too that we recently had on our Twitter. That was a trip.
Yeah, and maybe you share information of the arson, and then they say, well, it's a small minority of fires. Like, well, you didn't actually revise your, like, you still think your original thought.
It's a small minority
true.
of the 60% of man-caused fires.
Yeah. So even in cases where you can point to clear data, I think some people aren't, maybe the willingness isn't there to kind of change their mind, or to again think that institutions can be corrupt. I think they would look to this and be like, well, that individual at the lab breached they just maybe didn't follow the policy to the letter.
Yeah, they're a wild card. They're a renegade.
But that still doesn't explain why you wouldn't investigate, and why you wouldn't revise policy, and why you wouldn't ensure that this thing can't happen again.
Yeah. Well, why you would say in 2021 or 2022, whenever that article was, Patty Haydu would say, this is of such national security import that it can't be publicly discussed at this time. And then 2 years later, it's not going to be investigated at all. It literally cannot be both.
Yeah. Why ring the bell? Like, why is the alarm rung then?
Yeah.
And then now it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
So what was the change within that time? But the facts of the case haven't, like, the situation hasn't changed, like,
no,
in that time. So it's not like they discovered what context would make that right.
Yeah. Well, it's the Conservatives have said that this is or some members of some Conservative MPs on that committee have said that this is very obviously a move by the Liberal and NDP members of this committee to avoid potential embarrassment. But again, if this is something that is such a serious national security concern, you would think that the embarrassment factor of it is not as important as the potential ramifications for essentially admitting on the world stage, because this is a public committee in the House of Commons, like essentially admitting that when Canada faces issues or problems that are literally stated to be national security concerns, we don't investigate it. That's the embarrassing part.
What does that say about any of these other, like anytime a scandal comes up, are we just gonna like put it under the rug? Like,
yeah.
Is that our standard of practice?
Well, and what is CSIS to think of this too? Like, what are the officials of our, essentially the equivalent of our CIA? How can they? What does this mean for the future of how they act in relation to whatever government is in power at the time? If they don't believe that their investigations will be taken seriously, well, does that then open you up to even more problems regarding, related to potential like vigilante investigations or, willful, like we saw with the Trump presidency, where essentially the FBI and Trump the FBI wasn't giving information to Trump because they didn't feel it could be trusted with him. He was firing FBI agents and leaders pretty indiscriminately. And you can't have that sort of impasse between two essential institutions of a country if you want that country to function reliably.
Yeah, how is this benefiting Canada if our institutions are becoming more siloed in that way? Or there's a fear of, like, if there's a fear of speaking up or highlighting these problems within institutions, they're not going to get better. If there's no feedback mechanism to solve these problems, then that's what we would classify as institutional rot, where you'd get problems being hidden just to protect somebody's job or protect the overall image of a department. There's almost a incentive. This is where you get this idea that as governments get larger, they require more reasons to justify all these departments that they have.
Yeah.
They become more bloated, and then the department heads or whoever's control of that department, they want to keep a job, they want to keep funding, they want to keep their employees, and it doesn't naturally get smaller without top-down reforms. So I think there's natural incentives to anything that might hurt the position of any specific department within the government. There's a self-preservation that will always take over, if not for a good structure that allows reflection. So, but as we just make a larger government, the problem it will increase until you specifically downsize certain parts of it. So I think that's a risk over time. But we're talking about people's trust in these institutions. I don't think we're not giving more reasons for people to trust it. I just hope this is another example that maybe helps a few people realize maybe we shouldn't blindly trust these institutions.
Agreed. Well, James, we're at about an hour here. Was there anything else that you wanted to chat about?
I think that's a perfect place to wrap it up.
Okay. Well, thank you as always, sir. Always a pleasure chatting and catching up on the week. We'll, of course, have links in the description to everything we talked about, everything we showed. Always recommended reading for sure, so you know that we're not just making stuff up as we go along. And we'll see you again shortly. Thanks, guys. Thanks for watching.
All right. Cheers.